I hope you all have enjoyed the free break. We are now ready to begin our first session on labor markets, which will be chaired by Dr. Lutis. Dr. Lutis, please take us through the session.
Great, thank you. I'm very excited for our first session on labor markets. We will have Richard start off. And we ask people to hold their questions until the end of the presentation, and our presenters have 15 minutes. Our discussants will have 10 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes for additional questions.
Brilliant. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's on now. There we go. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organisers and the sponsors, firstly, for having me flying me all the way out from Cape Town. I really appreciate it. It's my first time in Pakistan, so I'm really looking forward to it. My name is Richard Freund. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town. Today I'll be presenting some work jointly with Rafael Novella at the University College London and David from the Inter-American Development Bank on a job training program for online freelancing in El Salvador. So very briefly about the motivation for the paper. As I'm sure we're all aware, particularly maybe in Pakistan, as well, digital platforms are reshaping the labour markets in the sense that they're offering individuals the opportunity to access global job and labour market opportunities. And so in this setting, online freelancing, where clients who are mostly from developed countries such as the USA post international jobs that they want people to complete remotely and then hire independent workers from all around the world. In theory, this presents a powerful mechanism for development whereby it facilitates virtual migration of people who can perform jobs that are remote without having to actually travel and migrate to where these job-rich regions are. In theory, that's great. However, we know there's more evidence coming out. The majority of people who are registered individuals never manage to successfully obtain any work on these platforms. For example, a paper in Latin America estimates that only around 10% of individuals manage to obtain any work, let alone a number of work, and the next paper being presented, which is great, and I have to discuss it, and also further shows that there's high concentration in these markets, whereby it's dominated by a few individuals, and some individuals never really manage to obtain much work on this. And so we were motivated by this, and particularly in the Ministry of the Economy of El Salvador and the Inter-American Development Bank, was on whether we can offer training for individuals to better engage with these marketplaces, such as set up a better profile, learn how to prepare and send good proposals, and will this lead to downstream labour market outcomes both on the platform and kind of broader, more welfare-related labour market outcomes. So just very briefly, going over some of the details for online freelancing in case you're not familiar with it. So there are these platforms such as Upwork, etc. Workers have to go on there, create a profile, and then they can get access to kind of these international jobs that they can complete remotely from their own bedroom, for example. So online gig work, where individuals perform online tasks, comes generally in two formats. There's micro work and there's online freelancing. I'm going to be speaking about online freelancing. It's just important to note that these involve projects that are a little bit longer and are typically a lot more complex. So they target people with kind of intermediate to high skills. These are things like web development, graphic design. It can also include things like data entry, but that's generally also thinking a little more about micro work. And so globally, as I just said, the most in-demand skills are related to web development. And so workers set up these profiles. They can apply directly to jobs by sending through a proposal that they write that the clients can evaluate, or clients can contact them directly based on their profile and say, hey, we'd like to look at your profile. This seems like a good fit for you. Can you apply to this job? Can you do this job? And so clearly successful freelancers need what we're deeming entrepreneurial skills to engage with these marketplaces. They need to know how to navigate the marketplaces, how to set up a good, attractive profile, how to write a proposal, all the way up to kind of how to actually negotiate with clients, finish a job, and get paid. And I'm not sure if you can see this clearly, but I just wanted to show on the left as an example of someone's profile. It's got a picture of them, their name, a write-up of their experience, their hourly wage, and those kind of things. And then on the right is, for example, some jobs that have been posted. You can click on it, apply, and write your proposal, etc. Just that's how kind of the user experience looks on Upwork, which is one of the largest online freelancing platforms. And so to give you a very brief overview, particularly in case I run out of time, in this paper we work with the Ministry of the Economy of El Salvador and the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as a training platform or training implementer called WISER. And we implement this online job training program that tries to teach individuals to better engage with these marketplaces. How do they set up a good profile? How do they write a good proposal? How do they kind of negotiate with clients, etc. The first thing to note is that it's an online job training program. It's completely asynchronous. People do it on their own time, but individuals did have kind of personalized tutors that they worked with. But despite this, we find low completion rates, like what Adrian was just saying with her online training. So just 16% of individuals in our treatment group completed the whole program in the sense that they did the theory and they also did the practical components. Despite this though, when we're looking at average kind of ITT effects, we find positive effects on key online freelancing outcomes. Treated individuals or those assigned to treatment are more likely to have a profile, send more proposals, as well as being contacted by one client and signing at least one freelancing contract. But despite this though, we find no sustained effects on the platforms, we find no effects on the number of contracts they sign, as well as any broader labour market outcomes. So to just briefly give you an overview about the intervention, so as I said, it was joint work between the Ministry of the Economy in El Salvador, the IDB, and the WISER, which is the job implementing kind of agency, who run these kind of programs about how to better engage with online freelancing platforms. And so it was a subscription design whereby we kind of wanted to get at least twice the individuals reserved for the capacity for the evaluation, which was 350 individuals in the treatment group. And individuals were randomly assigned to either being offered this program to help them engage with the platforms, be in a control, or be in a waiting list, which I'll show next. As I said, the key thing is that all learning was online. The ministry was very keen on this, particularly from a cost-effective point of view. It was asynchronous, but it was only an estimated engagement of around 5 hours per week, but each individual was assigned their own personalized tutor who helped them kind of accompany it through them, was there if they had any questions, and this was to try and increase in particular treatment completion rates. Just to note out, this wasn't targeted towards the poorest individuals in the country. Things like web development, graphic design are relatively complex, and so individuals needed to have completed studies in one of our 5 key areas in the streams, and this is at an undergraduate or a college level. They needed to have self-reported advanced English ability and computer and internet access. And so the program was designed in 2 phases. The first being individuals worked through 8 theory content modules, which was covering things like how to set up a good profile, how to write a good proposal, how to work with project management, secure information, all the way up to how do they get paid. And then the second phase of this, which was much shorter, but individuals were then expected to kind of more actively engage with the platforms, work with their tutors to try and obtain their first online freelancing contract during the period. And I won't focus on this much here, but also the program included an optional English for freelancers course, because the majority of work in online freelancing is conducted in English, and the jargon can often be quite specific as well. Cool. So I won't spend too much time on the experimental design. It was an individual level RCT. People were either randomly assigned to the treatment group, the control group, or a small proportion, around 5% of the treatment sample size was allocated to a waiting list, and we were told if people didn't take up their spot in the treatment, they would be randomly allocated to it instead. And this was relevant for around 16 individuals in the treatment group, so almost the entire treatment, the waiting list was randomly allocated to the treatment group in the end. For data, we don't really have as much data as 9 rounds that Adrian just presented, but we have baseline data through an application form, a rich application form. We have administrative data from the job training provider on how did they complete the training, how many modules did they complete, did they work with their tutors, etc. And then we conducted a follow-up survey of what Innovations for Poverty Action did around 1 year after the end of the treatment, measuring key outcomes. An online phone survey is obviously cheaper, but it suffers from higher attrition typically than in-person surveys. We did suffer from around 25% attrition, and attrition was differential in levels between treatment and control group. the treated individuals being around 10 percentage points more likely to answer the survey, but we find that attrition wasn't systematically related to baseline characteristics. But nevertheless, in our paper and in the results here, we present bounds around our treatment estimates to account for this differential attrition. As I said, we focus on ITT effects in the paper, so for each of our outcomes, we regressed on an indicator for ever being offered treatment. W is just an indicator for whether they were in the waiting list or not, and a vector of baseline characteristics included to improve precision that was selected for each outcome by post-double lasso selection methods. And as I said, we also present upper and lower bounds using the Kling-Lehman techniques, where we impute missing values for those who weren't found in the follow-up survey. So, in a sense, this is kind of one of our key outcomes of treatment take-up. We offered free training that we think was relevant and had zero financial cost to individuals, but we still find that treatment take-up was low. This is consistent with a number of interventions shown online, particularly asynchronous trainings. So around 40% of the treatment group completed the theory, but just 16% then continued to work with their tutor and send these kind of weekly feedback reports. And when we asked them why they didn't complete, the reasons were largely time constraints. People overestimated that they could do this in a week, as well as their other competing responsibilities, as well as some had infrastructure difficulties with access to the internet. So first we look at whether the treatment had any effect on online freelancing outcomes. That's kind of the first stage results. We find that despite the relatively low completion of the theory and particularly the practice, those who were assigned to treatment were significantly more likely to have a freelancing profile and send a significantly higher number of proposals. You can see there were roughly 16 more proposals that treated individuals sent 1 year after the training. So individuals seem to be better engaging with these marketplaces, setting up profiles, sending proposals. They were also around 19 percentage points more likely to have been contacted by at least one potential client, to suggest that they're actually setting up relatively good, attractive profiles that people are contacting them. And this results in a positive effect also on the probability of them signing at least one freelancing contract since the treatment ended, of around 5.8 percentage points, which sounds low, but it's around a 50% increase relative to the control group mean. It's a pretty sizable effect. Despite this though, despite this initial success from better profiles, better number of proposals, etc., we find no significant effect on the number of times they've been contacted by clients or on the number of contracts signed. So any initial success that they had due to better engagement doesn't seem to be leading to sustained success in the platform, in particular on the number of contracts that they've signed. And consistent with this, we also actually find no significant effects on any broader, potentially more welfare relevant labour market outcomes like current employment status, monthly income from their main job, having a formal job, etc. So in some senses, this program wasn't perhaps a failure. It helped people engage better with the profiles, but we have no sustained significant downstream labour market outcomes a year after training. I won't spend too long on this, but just to say we also looked at kind of non-cognitive or social-emotional outcomes. We find no significant effect of an index of self-reported satisfaction or entrepreneurial kind of mindset, but we do find a positive effect, albeit small, in the economic magnitude of individual self-efficacy. So maybe people feel like they can do things better as a result of this. I won't spend too long on the summary. I just want to walk through all this. Just to again reiterate, this training program tried to help people better engage with these marketplaces, how to set up a profile, how to write a good proposal, negotiate with clients, speak the English of online freelancing better. We find, like a lot of online job training programs, we struggled with treatment take-up. There was zero financial cost to this, but still many people didn't engage with it. Despite that, though, we find average ITT effects on key online freelancing outcomes, in particular some initial success on getting at least one contract, but we find a lack of follow-through whereby this initial success didn't translate into sustained success on the platform or broader labour market outcomes. And so this really begs the question, why? What are the key barriers there? And this is something that we're still doing ongoing analysis for, but as part of the follow-up survey, we asked individuals who had a contract about their average rating, or their rating on the platform. And we think that a lack of kind of technical or perceived technical ability is the real binding constraint here as well. Firstly, we find no significant difference in the average rating given between treatment and control groups. This potentially makes sense. We didn't target technical ability. But secondly, we find for everyone in our sample that the average rating they're getting from clients is substantially below, more than 1 star below the average rating on the Upwork platform in general. And so the rating that they're getting given by clients is not great. And in a setting that we have in these online labor markets of increasing oversupply of labor, the rating you get in your first job is potentially very important then for any future success. If you get a below average or particularly a well below average rating, you may find it very hard then to engage with future clients and get future work. So this is something I think future research in particular is needed on how do we get people better online freelancing outcomes, what are the key barriers to sustain success on these platforms for individuals who just joined up for the first time. And so I'm excited for the next paper as well. And then lastly, just to end off and say that actually just an interesting outcome also is that online freelancing really may not be the first employment path for some individuals. Yes, it's high skilled, yes, it's flexible in particular, but around 35% of our sample who were working as freelancers said that they don't think they would be in a year's time, and the main reason is that their income is unstable. So online freelancing, micro work, all these online kind of gig works have advantages that they're flexible, they allow you to work from home, etc., but they have the disadvantage of limited career progression and also particularly instability of resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we will have Nina for the discussion.
a lot of things that I've written here, it became clear to me while Richard was presenting, but I have presented it before, so I'm just going to say. So the paper estimates an intention to shrink of the program, and the literature usually have like a completion rate of around 65%, but in longer training programs this is much lower. So what I thought was that this could be discussed in the paper, that it's actually not a very strange thing that the completion rate is low. It is something that is actually in other clinical systems. So, and the other thing that Richard was mentioning, and it became more clear for me, was the demand for freelancers based in El Salvador, because I was wondering why is it that we have to have English training. And then I realized that actually most of the demand for the freelancers comes from the US, and I didn't know that. So that became clear when Richard was presenting. And the other comment that I had was about heterogeneity analysis, because I thought that given that 55% of the sample is women, if you could do some heterogeneity analysis by gender to find if the impact of training for women and men are different, given that in active labor market policy in Latin America has been shown to be more effective for women. The other heterogeneity analysis that I thought would be interesting was that the willingness to work as a freelancer was 95% in the baseline, and then it got reduced to 37%. So the reason was income disability. And one of the facts that we know in the literature is that women are very women are more risk-averse than men. So, and there are papers that actually study this. And what I was thinking is that you could see if this drop is larger for women because women are more risk-averse, so they don't like the variance in their income. And if this is the case, then maybe training programs target to risk preferences could also help women freelancing jobs. That was it.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation and excellent discussion. We will now open the floor up for comments. And so, as chair prerogative and as the first session, I'm going to make my own rules. So we're going to take a couple questions and then maybe respond to them and then discuss it all at the same time. That works for everybody? Questions? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for the interesting presentation. What I'm wondering is that, so the job offers that these freelancers are getting, do you have any idea from your data that where are these job offers concentrated? What I'm trying to understand is that these job offers that they're getting after the intervention, are they any different from what they were getting at the baseline? Are there any skills or any sectors where the job offers are concentrated? And secondly, you know from your data that at the baseline, what is the rate of getting job offers?
Great, another question or two? Yes, please.
Hi. First of all, this is very interesting paper and totally related to Pakistan, as given we are often faced with current economic statistics. I believe that the freelancing might help us to solve it. So I have two questions. First of all, sorry if I have missed it. What were the content of the trainings, and like on what outcomes or like I want to know about the training material, on what skills they have been trained on, and secondly, how are we measuring the self-efficacy? Is it self-reported or is there any broad-based measure that you are using?
Great, another question? Yes.
I just want to elaborate on, add to that earlier question, that exactly what was the training about, was there any skills? And then, I know this is normally maybe not done, but those who completed the program or did most of the program, I mean, you could put it there, did they have more second offers or did them rating improve or whatever? That would be interesting.
I see one more question in the back, yes.
Hi, yes, I just
freelancers from El Salvador were seeking employment, like whether they were primarily trying to go for like, US, UK, Canada kind of market, or whether there were some who were targeting more regional, where they might have an advantage in terms of the language and all. Just because, thinking about, let's say people hiring, in the US or the UK, they might not think of a Spanish-speaking country as the place where they would primarily be seeking freelancers. They would maybe, go towards, and that's where like countries like India and Pakistan have an advantage of, having some history with the English language more so than, maybe than Latin America.
Great, so it take 2 minutes to respond to some, all, none, whatever you like.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much, both Lina as well as everyone who asked questions. Firstly, I just want to apologize. This is joint work with Victoria Fazio and Dalla Rosa Shady. They're both at the IDB, they're different projects, like at the slides from. The question on Haiti, what's the difference, is a great one. It was essentially the same training program that we ran, but with a very small pilot study. So it was 50 treated, 50 control. It was really just to test the implementation of the program. But it is interesting, they're different contexts, French speaking versus Spanish speaking, it's different development levels. Haiti is a much poorer country than El Salvador, so the distribution of workers we're talking about here is different, but yet we find very similar findings. Positive effect on kind of these first stage results, in particular on sending proposals, etc., but no effects on downstream labour market outcomes, which I think helps a little bit with the external validity of our findings, particularly of our larger El Salvador study. Completely taken points that are both taken about, are there differential larger effects for those who complete the program, or at least the theoretical component, let's say 40%. I'm still working on the local average treatment effect estimations, but what I will say is preliminary work suggests we find larger effect of what we're finding here, so larger increases in obtaining at least one contract, but still no positive effect on the number of contracts or in any downstream labour market outcomes. Let's say on the markets, so most of the jobs that are presented according to the online labour index based at the University of Oxford are from the US, around 30 to 35% of jobs. India is increasing its use of posting jobs as well, but these are mostly in English as well. And Spanish-speaking jobs are prevalent. They're on different platforms most of the time, not on things like Upwork, but they're much lower. And so we don't actually know what jobs people are going for, but it's very likely they're being applied to, as well as getting contacted for English jobs. For example, in El Salvador, it's estimated that less than 0.5% are actually local jobs that people, or the total jobs are local jobs posted by El Salvador firms. So we don't know offhand, but I think so. I'm also looking at heterogeneity according to sex, so that's a great point, and I think something that's really important because there is other work that shows that online freelancing is potentially beneficial for women given the greater flexibility of it as well. So I do want to look at that and definitely point taken. Unfortunately, we don't know what the job offers that people are getting or the contracts look like. We don't have administrative data from Upwork, unfortunately. And we've tried to look for individuals on the platform actually, and the Upwork search platform or search function is really poor, and we actually just can't find them. What I will say is I don't know if they're different from what people were getting at baseline, but essentially people weren't getting contracts at baseline. Only around 7% of our sample had ever worked as an online freelancer at baseline, and the average number of contracts was 0. Very few people had ever successfully gotten a freelancing contract. So in that sense, I guess they're different. In terms of the content, and we can chat more afterwards as well, but they weren't actually getting many hard skills or technical skills. It was content primarily in terms of documents as well as online kind of explanatory videos and examples of things like how to set up a profile, what constitutes a good profile, what are clients looking for in a profile, how to write a good proposal, the language used, as well as kind of what you need to put in the content. So it's different instructional videos over the 8 contents on things like setting up a profile all the way up to how you actually secure it and get paid.
Sorry.
Cool.
As my job's chair, I think I'm supposed to cut people off. So I encourage everyone to continue the conversation during lunch and at the break. These are really interesting things for us to think about. And now we're going to have
So this is joint work that I'm presenting with Dunya, who's right here, and Rebecca at Chicago. This is a new project that we started very recently, and we have done some exploratory work based on which we have preliminary findings. So, I mean, your comments and suggestions will be really useful to us at this stage of the project. So, looking forward to that. There has been tremendous growth in online freelancing, as you also saw in some of the statistics that were just presented before my talk. And this growth has been happening over the past few years across the world. And what we've seen is, according to this recent study that came out last year, there are at the moment around 154 million online gig workers globally. And if we were to include those who work as secondary workers or as marginalized workers, then this number goes up to 435 million workers globally. Now that's a huge number. In terms of thinking about what proportion they contribute towards the global labor force, that ranges between 4.5 to 12.5%. And more than 50% of these workers, they originate from South Asia. And what we've also seen is that numerous online platforms have emerged, like Upwork, Guru, Fiverr, etc. And the purpose of these platforms is what? It's to maximize or increase market access for freelancers, and with little entry fee. So there is an entry fee, but that's pretty low in terms of, if you think about the overall proportion. But despite that, when we look at data from the Pakistani freelance market, what we find is that the market is heavily concentrated amongst a few superstar freelancers or the top freelancers. Again, this is something that Richard also pointed out in his presentation earlier. And qualitative interviews with numerous freelancers for this project have also shown us that many of these superstar freelancers, so to speak, what they do is they hire workers off platform in order to get work done and in order to get projects done that are sourced through the platform through their individual online profiles. So in some sense, you can think of these superstar freelancers as acting as an intermediary where they are hiring and managing workers off platform in order to get tasks done that are received on the platform. Now this seems surprising, the presence of these invisible freelancers, so to speak, given that the entire purpose of these digital platforms is to increase market access and to allow direct trade between the customer and the worker. So in this context, in this background, our project aims to understand why do we have these intermediaries, why do these intermediaries arise in the first place in these seemingly decentralized labor markets. So back in 2001, when internet was not being used as commonly and widely, this really interesting paper came out in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which talked about potential issues that are likely to arise in the future with the growth of online labor markets. And what this paper talked about was it would become harder to assess worker quality ex ante, and it will also become there would also be absence of in-person monitoring and in-person assistance in case of issues. So the prediction was that this will lead to labor intermediaries with reputation that will try to mitigate these issues. And the argument was also that these problems would likely be even more pronounced for developing countries where generally credentials such as education they're harder to recognize and verify, and workers might be facing additional constraints like language barriers, we just talked about that, or lack of familiarity with different business practices. So given this, we're trying to understand why do these intermediaries arise, why do workers join these intermediaries, and we hypothesized that this might be because of one of these two hypotheses. The first is because these workers face skills constraints. So perhaps they lack these skills that are necessary to serve the customer, and therefore they prefer to collaborate with others who might have complementary skills to be able to do the task better. So that's one particular hypothesis that we want to test. And then the second potential possibility is that they join these intermediaries because they perhaps face entry barriers, because they lack reputation, these novice freelancers. It's hard for them to kind of get work, to generate work. As we also saw again in Richard's presentation, that only about 7% of these freelancers have done any work, at baseline. So in this particular particular project, we're only going to focus on the first hypothesis, which is the skills constraint hypothesis, and we're going to try and understand that better. The approach that we are taking is as follows. As a first step, we want to identify these intermediaries on the platform. We want to document their characteristics and compare them with those of solo workers. And as a next step, we want to test whether being with an intermediary, it increases worker productivity, and we want to understand that by one, measuring worker performance both within the intermediary as well as outside, and also by understanding what happens to learning. Is the trajectory of learning different for workers who join intermediaries versus those who work as solo workers on their own? We hope that this work will contribute to two strands of literature, one on frictions, looking at frictions in the online labor market, and the second that looks at the role of intermediaries in the developing country context, which finds in the goods market, for instance, we know that this literature shows us that having these middlemen and intermediaries, they reduce search costs, they reduce trade costs, they also allow access to quality insurance. In the context of the labor market, we know that this literature shows that they facilitate job matching. So our contribution is in this work to study a novel form of labor intermediary, which we think ends up improving service production as well as worker quality. So the assignment part I'm going to skip was already covered in the previous presentation. So the approach that we take primarily in this project is that we've taken so far in the exploratory work that we've done is, one, we hired workers on Upwork, we hired freelancers on Upwork, and this we're calling the pilot sample. So we worked with 30 freelancers, and out of these about 12 were intermediaries and 18 were independent workers. And then the second thing that we did was we scraped data on freelancer profiles on Upwork, specifically for data entry workers as well as for graphic design workers, and this gave us an observational sample of about 5,000 data entry workers. I'm not going to get into the discussion about graphic design workers right now, but essentially in terms of the hiring procedure, so we obviously put up jobs and then we interviewed these candidates, we assigned them a particular data entry task along with a detailed set of instructions, then we evaluated their performance, and after the task was completed, we invited them for another interview in which we collected additional data. So at each step of this process, we collected data. Before the interview, before assigning the task, we got information about whether that individual was working as an independent worker or was managing a team of freelancers. Then after the task was completed, we collected data on their performance, and then subsequently the post-task completion interview, we collected data on general data on in terms of their profile, their tenure on the platform, the time used, etc., and then intermediary specific information which related to the organizational practices within that firm and the wages, the management practices that they had. And then in terms of the observational data that we had, about 5,000 freelancers, using that data we created two subsets of data. One was the freelancer roster. Again, this had freelancer specific information in terms of their hourly rates, their job success, total jobs they completed, total earnings, etc., whether they had a badge or not. And then we also had a job history panel. For this, we had information for up to 200 jobs that the person had done, and for each job, we have information on earnings and job duration and ratings, etc. For external validity, we also scraped data for Bangladeshi and Indian freelancers for the same sector and for data entry, which I'm talking about right now, but also for graphic design. So what we're showing here now is in this graph, we're looking at the extent of concentration, market concentration, and what we're plotting on the x-axis, we rank each freelancer according to the number of jobs that the person has completed, and on the y-axis then we're plotting the cumulative share of jobs by quantiles. And what we find is about 70% of the total jobs that have been completed are done by the top 10% of the freelancers. So 10% of the freelancers do about 40% of these, 10% of them to 70% of the jobs. How do I go to the hyperlink? Yeah. So just want to show this. So this is, we see a similar trend by country and by sector also. So what we're showing in this here, on the left panel we have data entry workers for Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, and we're showing what proportion of total jobs were completed by the top 10 freelancers, and on the right panel we have graphic design workers, and in both cases what we're seeing is for both countries and across both, or for all three countries and across both sectors, what we're seeing is that between 70 to 80% of the total jobs are done by the top 10 freelancers. Okay, next we compare characteristics of freelancers from our pilot sample, which is the 30 people that we recruited on Upwork, and we're comparing that with the characteristics of freelancers from the observational sample, which is about 5,000 freelancers that we have on data entry. And what do we see here? If you look at the first two columns in this table, we're comparing characteristics, average characteristics within our pilot sample. We're comparing average characteristics between those who are intermediaries and those who work independently. And what we find is that on average, intermediaries have much more experience in terms of their tenure on the platform, in terms of the number of jobs completed. They are also more likely to have a badge and be rated as be top rated. They also have more earnings on average. So that's one important finding that we learn from this table. The second is, if we compare the first column with the second last column on this table, that is a comparison of average characteristics of freelancers from our pilot sample and average characteristics of the top 10% of the freelancers within the bigger data set that we have from the data scraping exercise. And what we find is that their average characteristics are very similar. So the intermediaries that we have in our pilot sample on average have similar characteristics to the top freelancers on Upwork. So they have more experience, they have more earnings on average, they've completed more jobs, and they're also top rated on the platform. The next thing that we look at is how was the performance within our pilot sample, how was the average performance. So we constructed this performance index based on, as I said, we had very detailed instructions, so things on whether they followed instructions, whether they completed the work on time, what was the level of communication, etc. So based on all of that data, we construct this average performance index, and on the left hand side we have average performance of individual workers who work independently, and on the other side the orange is the ones who are intermediaries. We don't see much difference between the two. So we're trying to think more about these results and what have we learned so far. One, what we've learned so far is that the market is extremely concentrated. Two, that these intermediaries, when we do detailed qualitative interviews with them, what we've learned is that there's very clear division of labor within the way they work. So the owner would be in touch with the customer. That person would be the one who would be assigning tasks and helping workers through complex things and doing a final quality check. And the worker, on the other hand, is mainly responsible for doing just the work and then doing an initial quality check. So there seems to be clear division of labor. What we've also learned is that some of these intermediaries told us, these freelancers told us that some of our past workers, they have transitioned, so they would work for us for some time, and now they've transitioned into doing independent work. So even though we would expect, we see that these intermediaries are more experienced, but despite that, we're not seeing much difference between average performance. So there's clearly selection that's there. The workers, there's selection on the platform. People who eventually decide to work independently are perhaps different from the ones who don't, right? Who end up working with intermediaries. So to unwrap all of these things, what we're proposing going forward is an experimental design, and I'm just going to take 2 minutes to talk about this. We've recently secured a collaboration with PITB, Punjab So what our plan is either to work with university students who intend to enter the freelancing sector, or to work with alumni of their local freelancer network, so people who've trained with them but have not yet started earning. So that's going to be our worker sample. Then we have our intermediary sample that we've identified both from the exploratory work that we've done so far, plus there are some intermediaries and firms within the PITP freelancer network also. And what we want to do is we want to assign these new workers to either join the platform, which is Upwork, or to work with intermediaries through a 3-phase design. So the plan is that we'll assign some workers to work on the platform and others to work with intermediaries, and then assign them tasks and compare performance between treated and control to see whether workers who work with intermediaries do better versus those who are on the platform. And then subsequently we want to follow them up after a few months and give them additional tasks and compare performance of the same set of workers within control and within treated to see how learning levels change if you are working within a group of freelancers versus if you're working independently. So that's the plan moving forward, which we hope to execute later this year. But that's all from me, and I'm sorry for going a few minutes over. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll have a discussion by Richard.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'll try to stick to time as well. Just for the sake of time in particular, I'm going to skip the summary as well. I think we all know what it is about. I'll first go to what I really like about the paper. I always like highlighting this. So firstly, I think it's a fascinating topic. Highlighting the role of intermediaries in the online marketplace is not something that I've thought about, it's not something that I've read about, it's not something that I've seen empirically quantified or anything like that. So I think for me, super clear contribution to the online marketplace literature in particular, and also just broader intermediary literature. I think a lot of careful data work has been done, particularly with the web scraping and just characterizing the online freelancing marketplace. So depending on how much of a rush you are to try to publish this work, I think it could almost be 2 separate papers. One descriptive characterizing the marketplace and one with the experimental work as well. I think the contribution just of the descriptive one highlighting and quantifying the concentration in the marketplace, the relationship you didn't show here between offered price and the number of jobs you had, and the U-shaped curve, super clear, really interesting contributions in and of themselves about the experiments. That being said, I think the ongoing experiment is really interesting and super good paper that I enjoyed reading with lots of comments, I think. So I won't touch on all of these works because some are finicky and I can send these to you, but in particular I think just a little bit more emphasis needs to be given on the sampling, particularly given that potentially you want the reader to try and draw inferences from the data work to kind of the broader labour markets or the online freelancing in each country or as a whole. So you say you use a representative sample. Here you mentioned that you scrape profiles. I'm not really sure how practically that worked. Did you actually take all profiles, or it seems like it was a representative subset, but what was the sampling frame? How did you go about that? Just to convince me as the reader that it really is representative, and I know how we did it as well. And in particular on the pilot sample as well, the experiments, it's absolutely fine if you don't want to try to draw external validity from that, but I think if you do, then just giving us a little bit more information about how the 30 were chosen, were they a random subset of the random subsample already, can we think about that this is representative at a very small level, that is even partially representative of the general kind of freelancing marketplace, or is it a highly select 30, and maybe we need to think a bit more carefully about representativeness, but nevertheless, the findings will be super interesting and informative. Cool. On the findings, some of these are very nitpicky, so don't worry about this. The first thing I just want to say is, I don't know if you are able to get a more granular proxy of technical technical ability or perceived technical ability, so their average ratings on the platform, to compare those between intermediaries and workers would be really interesting. And also just if you could give a little bit more detail, potentially in an appendix, on how your kind of performance measure is actually measured would be really useful. Just giving, for example, a description of the variables that go into the index. For example, I wasn't sure if you had anything actually on whether the percentage of data entry, like being correct was in there. It seems for me to be about communication and adherence to instruction, which is important, but as you said, maybe managed by the intermediary themselves, not the worker underneath them, and so it could have different implications. Yeah, and then I just lastly just want to say, you didn't speak about it here, but you do some cool, careful work on trying to use the variable you have and use some machine learning techniques to predict who's an intermediary and then take us to the broader sample. I just want to say maybe be a little more suggestive about that because your 30 is very small and obviously it's a potentially a very significant group as well. But overall, a really good paper and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're going to open it now up to questions. And is it okay to take a question and take a response to everybody? Great. Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. One suggestion. This indicator of market concentration, I think I was mainly using percentages because the problem with it is that if you want to compare across countries, more often you will end up with a similar percentage. So an alternate way would be that if I pick 100 superstar freelancers, what percentage of contracts they are getting, and then we will see maybe more variation across countries. Saying that I think that will also be helpful in defining the market concentration. Or we can use the standard like from the business model, like what are the top 5. You see the market share, for instance. The other one was like you think about this aspect of self-selection to subcontracting by those who are not willing to work full time. For example, they could only do part of their time rather than full time. So they would always prefer being a subcontractor rather than full-fledged freelancers.
Great. Any question over here?
Thank you, Mama. This is really interesting and I'm looking forward to the results. So I was thinking more around the measures that you want to have in an experiment. So I think one presumption is that the perhaps intermediaries are extracted, and so if you are independent, you may be able to earn more, but it would be nice to actually test that because presumably, I mean, there may have been some efficiency in the market, they sorted themselves into the roles that they want to take. And so you may want to see what is the impact of a worker within the team that is being managed by an intermediary. You could think of them as a leader of that team. So the team leader may be adding some value as well, and part of that value may be being shared with the workers. Perhaps the workers are just better off in that team, even if it's a individual. As I said, some of them then learn, they go and work independently. But before that, perhaps it is welfare intensive, right? So it would be really nice to actually separate the two out. And I think it's just a matter of thinking of what measures you could put in that you can see independently what the manager is adding, what the worker is doing, and the contribution of the worker in a team versus independent.
Okay, one more question.
So recently, surveys being conducted by LinkedIn in the USA, and they found that the 7 people would like to leave their jobs due to bad bosses, and the tendency was more prevalent in the case of Gen Z and millennials. So probably what we have seen in this particular context, that we have seen a positive spillover from these intermediaries. But these agile and network-based organizations ultimately are going to have the dark side of it. And is your research planning to take care of those particular aspects, because that is going to be insightful along with the positive message we are getting from these intermediaries.
Great. Anyone has some of these comments? Thank you so much. These are great questions and comments. I'll start with some of Richard's comments about sampling. So yes, when we say representative sample, we extracted information for all those individuals who had data entry as their tag. They had that tag on their profile, and similarly for graphic designers. So it's all the universe of workers with that tag on the platform, on this particular platform. The 30 freelancers, so we put up a job ad, we had people submit proposals, and according to the wages that we
market, and then from those we selected a subset, and then we interviewed them and released the data entry task. So they were not necessarily picked up randomly. All the people who expressed interest in response to the job ad from out of that sample we collected. Then the productivity tests. So this is something we wanted to do. So we also wanted to do a pilot of the experimental design that we were just talking about, which is to give them another task. So the idea was to identify the worker within the intermediary who had actually worked on a data entry task and compare that, and give a second task to compare that person's performance and compare on average with those who had worked independently. We realized this is not feasible moving forward. The reason being that intermediaries were not comfortable in giving us access to their workers, so they were not comfortable in sharing, and that is why we decided to take this alternative path of trying to work with new workers, new individuals who have not yet started working, and establish contact from that point onwards, because we feel that moving forward it would be easier to stay in touch and follow up with those workers rather than working with firms, with workers who are already working in the market. The performance measure, so we had, yes, it did include accuracy, so that was also one of the dimensions. We had a series of things about whether, so we had really specific instructions about how the table should look like, what the row should look like, the formatting, those kinds of things. So we did calculate number of mistakes the person made and how closely they followed instructions, whether they met the deadline and all of that. But I agree we need to have more details on this in the write-up. Lagarde's comment about looking at concentration, I think you make a very valid point. We should definitely look at alternative measures of concentration. But generally what we find from other studies also, and from big trend reports like World Bank or Labor Observatory trends, the trend that we find in our paper is very, very similar to what other studies have found. But we can definitely look at that. And the point that Farah you made, that's something that we have been struggling with. So we started this thinking that intermediaries are bad. In fact, I remember having this meeting with Dr. Nahid, and we were insistent on this point of view, and he was kind of coming back and arguing with us that no, maybe this is right for the market, and this is right for the workers because they perhaps don't have the ability to immediately start working on their own or whatever. So I think as we've done this exploratory work, we've realized that ex ante we cannot say anything as to what having intermediaries is adding to this market. It could be positive, which we are actually finding that being with an intermediary helps workers learn more, might be good if they're part-time, that might be a preference that they have. It also might help them overcome skill constraints, especially communication and language. That's a big constraint for a lot of workers, new workers. But they are extractive. So what we've also found is the margins that these intermediaries keep, they range between 40 to 90%. So we've also come across intermediaries who very openly told us that we keep as much as 90% of the returns, and only 10% of that is actually distributed to the workers. So we don't know, and we hope that we have better answers in due course.
Great, more excellent discussion, and I encourage everyone again to keep talking over lunch with us. Lena, please.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Female Employment, Marriage and Childcare, and it's motivated by the fact that when we look at lifetime career decisions of women, we often see that women take career breaks when they have children. The consequence of this is that they accumulate less work experience, and they might have lower wages in the future and lower income that they can spend on themselves and on their children. What I want to do in this paper is that I want to see how childcare policies affect the employment of single and married individuals. So the talk is motivated by several observations in the data. So in this figure you see years when first birth on the x-axis and the proportion of non-working women on the y-axis. And we can see that right after birth, many women stop working. And this is a well-established fact in the economics literature, But one factor that receives less attention is that among those women who are working, a lot of them work part-time. So part-time allows women to accumulate some type of human capital, but when the human capital that women accumulate, then it's not the same as the human capital they accumulate when they work. So also, the third observation that we have in the data is that childcare that women use, this is childcare in terms of services that they buy in the market, these childcare services very much depend on the employment status of women. So we can see that here that those rules on the x-axis here have child's age, and on the y-axis I have hours that the child spends in the childcare. And we can see that full-time working women, the green line, they purchase more childcare in the market, part-time employed individuals purchase less, and then those who are not working use the least of these childcare services. So, presence of young children is associated with lower female labor supply. The potential reason for this lower labor supply is that we want to spend more time with their children. The potential, I don't know how to.
It's only just.
So the potential drawback of lower female labor supply is that then, and not using childcare, is that then they will have, they will have lower future wages. Why? Because they don't accumulate any work experience. If they don't work, and if they work part-time, then they have a different type of human capital, which can affect their hourly wages in the future. And we know that in the literature, we know that there's a part-time pay penalty, which is associated with those who are working part-time. So the next observation that I have in the data is that single and unmarried women, they have a very different labor supply. So if you look at the two bars on top of this graph, we have single non-mothers and married non-mothers. And you can see that around 71% of single non-mothers are working full-time, while married non-mothers, 58% of them are working full-time. And then if you look at these, the two lower bars, you can see that after having children, this difference between the single mothers and married mothers becomes larger. So what I want to say in this figure is that a lot of time women actually start to specialize in household production when they have children, or even when they get married. So when they get married, they start to specialize in household production, and then this specialization becomes more important when they have children. So potential reason for lower labor supply is the lower labor supply of married women compared to single women is this process of household specialization. Women specialize in household production. For example, think about this household specialization as cooking or as spending time with the child, which produces something like child quality. And are there any consequences for this specialization? The consequence is that they will have lower future, these women will have lower future wages in the future. And then if divorce happens, if there's a shock to marriage and divorce happens, what happens is that these women will have lower income for themselves and lower income to spend on themselves and their children. So given these figures that I showed you, I want to see in a country with very ungenerous family work policies, as the United States, how would childcare subsidies, if you provide women with families with childcare, how would that affect the process of human capital accumulation and the part-time and full-time employment decisions of married and single women, their work experience and wages, and their marital decisions. To do this, I developed a dynamic model. In the model, I have several decisions that are made by the household. One is fertility, employment, marital decisions, and childcare decisions. Then I estimate the model using simulated performance, using very early data from 1968 until 1997 of the PSID in the United States. And then after that, I use the simulated model to evaluate the impact of childcare subsidies on the cost of human capital accumulation estimate the model, and then I find how would childcare subsidy programs affect low-entry and marital decisions. So I find that a 10% decrease in the cost of childcare increases the low-entry of married mothers by 0.8% and single mothers by 1.4%. And the reason for that is that married mothers have larger income effects based on less. And I find that single lower educated women are the most responsive to these policies. And I also evaluate the impact on marital decisions, which is the main contribution of my paper, because single and married women respond differently to these policies, and I show that actually these policies could also affect marital decisions. So I show that 10% increase in the cost of childcare decreases fraction of divorced individuals by 0.8%, and that of higher educated individuals by 0.3%. So the key features of the model that I have is that I have endogenous part-time and full-time human capital accumulation, I have endogenous fertility, endogenous childcare, marriage, and separation. And I model all these 4 decisions in a collective household model in a dynamic framework with no commitment, which has not been done in the literature. So what do I mean by a collective household model in a dynamic framework with no commitment? So this framework allows me to relax some unitary assumption, which has been questioned in the literature, and it allows me to show that how considerations of women, of what they will earn after divorce, will affect today's decision, how much work, and if they have children, how much childcare to use, how would that consideration affect the current decision about how much work. So the model is a finite horizon model. Men and women start their life after completing education, and in each period, individuals, which are men and women, they decide how much work. That variable that reports this is L, whether to have a child, how many hours of formal childcare to purchase, and whether to stay single, get married, or so I model all of these decisions. So preferences in the models, I have this linear utility function, and then we may gain utility from consumption of a private good and the production of a household good, which is that Q. So why is this important? Because the production of this household good allows me to take into account a specialization in the household. When individuals have children, then they not only get value from, for example, Q, which can be value of a clean house or a meal or anything. Not only they get value from that, but also the time that they spend with the child gives them something. I don't take any stance on what that child quality is. So I don't say that it's the cognitive development of the child, it is how cute the child is, how kind the child is. I don't take any stance on this because I said that parents just get utility from this child quality and I don't take any stance on what that is. So this framework allows me to take into account the trade-off between working, which if you work, then you will have more income, but if you spend more time in household production, then you will have lower income in the future. But then you will get more of those household goods. I make several assumptions in the model, and many people don't like this. I don't like to find out, but I make assumptions. So the time constraint is that individuals spend their time only on labor market hours or housework hours. And so this basically, I'm assuming there's no leisure. Single individuals produce the first household good, which is the value of a clean house, let's call it, by just putting that hours that they have, they don't spend in the labor market in the production of that household good. And then if individuals have a child, then they also can use childcare. And then I estimate the degree of substitutability between childcare and housework hours, and that's an important parameter in the model. So I'm going to go a bit quicker. So the dynamic, I introduced the dynamic to the model using the learning by doing framework, which people if they work, they can make more human capital, and household members make their own labor certified and fertility and all childcare choice and everything. We make those choices using actual RNA. Okay, so let me just briefly go through my parameter estimates. So when I estimate the degree of substitutability that childcare and housework hours are close substitutes. So what does that mean? It means that parents should be able to substitute childcare services with housework hours that they have to spend with the child if they don't work. So these are close substitutes. They can do that and they can increase their labor supply. I also find that the marginal utility from household productions, like those alpha Qs, those are larger than the marginal utility from consumption. This shows that there are large gains from specialization in the households. Then I take these parameters. I have 32 parameters. I'm just showing 3 parameters here, but I also have all of these parameters just related to the performance, and then I see how providing household with universal childcare subsidies affect their childcare take-up, employment, marital decisions, and their lifetime value. So here, on the x-axis, I have the percent of childcare was subsidized, and on the y-axis, I have hours of formal childcare that individuals purchase. So we can see that as we subsidize more childcare, take-up increases. Why? Because childcare is an input to the production of the child quality. So if you subsidize it, people use more to improve their child quality. Although I observe this, what I don't observe is that the employment decisions are not responsive. So I find that the employment decisions of single or divorced individuals are more responsive, and especially single or divorced individuals from lower educated backgrounds. I also show that these policies affect marital decisions. So what happens here is that if you subsidize childcare, people start to have children earlier, and then that increases the income specialization. Then if I'm married, then because of the income of the husband, if the subsidized if the childcare is not subsidized fully, there is still gains from specialization in the household. So then I can see that the fraction of married individuals increases up to a certain. As soon as you start subsidizing childcare above a certain threshold, then what happens is that then I can buy the childcare myself. Childcare 95% of the cost of childcare is subsidized, then I can buy childcare if I get divorced. So we can see that the fraction of divorced individuals increases. Yes. So I estimated a dynamic model affecting employment and childcare mental decisions, taking into account differences between part-time and full-time human capital accumulation, and I estimate the substitutability between housework hours and market childcare. And then I evaluate the impact of these subsidy programs. So what I find is that CL and lower educated women are more responsive. This is in line with the previous literature. And the reason that I see the fraction of divorced individuals declines and married individuals, more people get married, is because childcare subsidies increase the income specialization.
I'm Liz Hammond. So I really enjoyed reading this paper. And so I think this paper is interesting because the effects of childcare costs are important to study. And, you know, in one hand, that's obvious. On the other hand, economists have largely ignored it because that is something that women folk have to worry about, and economists are notoriously men folk. But think about it, right? People have children, and workers with children need childcare. And reducing costs can really change the labor supply. It makes work less expensive, right? If you don't have to pay as much for your childcare, you can keep more of your earnings. And then reducing costs could also affect the marriage decision, right? Reduce the need for a second income or a spousal childcare. And so what this paper does is it develops a discrete choice dynamic programming model and a collective framework. Endogenously determines wages, employment, right? Thinking about both yes employment, no employment, but also part-time employment, different levels of part-time employment. Formal childcare take-up, fertility, marriage, and divorce. Uses a matched bargaining framework for household decisions, and it estimates the model with the USPSID. And so the paper finds that childcare subsidies increase childcare take-up, right? childcare is a normal good. And the more generous the policy, the higher the employment response, but it kind of maxes out from, very limited, about a 60% subsidy. And then this, I think, this is something I did not see coming, and then the paper convinced me of it, is that, child care subsidies less than 60% actually increase marriage, right? I kind of came into this with, as soon as you start subsidizing child care, you're going to decrease marriage or increase divorce, but that's not true, right? And that's because of this gains from specialization. So I think this is a nice finding and something that, I didn't see coming. And so I went on the rest of my time just thinking about, the bigger picture issues this paper brings up, maybe some larger questions. And my guess is that the response to this is going to be like, that's not this paper. Or so maybe hopefully this will give you some ideas for the next paper. But the model is estimated using the PSID from 1968 to 1997. And so my first question is the nature of childbearing, childcare, women's work different today than it was in 1897 and certainly than it was in 1968, right? And as economists, we can't just invent data that don't exist, but maybe one path forward on this is to think about splitting the sample. And if you have enough data to estimate on like an early versus late, and if the findings are the same, then you can say, okay, then we make things later is even more the same. Or if there's some difference between early versus late, that might have more insights into the even later. And just to kind of give you some ideas of how this period is different, the average age at first birth was 21 in 1970, and it was 27 in 2024. And what really struck me was that in your sample statistics, that the average age is 33, and 75% of 33 average age people have at least one child, which I think would not be the case for similarly aged people today. Another question is thinking about child care subsidies. I think this paper takes these are free, they're just kind of gifts, right? But that's not what really happened, right? So first, assume the US government balances its budget, but right, eventually someone's gonna have to pay for these. So, from a social planner perspective, what would the social planner solution be? Because there's increasing wages on one side or increasing hours worked. On the other side, there's this taxation, and I only have a minute. And then can you benchmark to other programs to support working families, which if you know anything about the US, you should say, what other programs? But maybe there are some other programs. And then thinking about how much would a subsidy have to be to reduce prices by 10%. So I know in the higher education literature, when you give people grants, the colleges just raise their prices. Right? So maybe you need larger than a 10% subsidy to reduce prices by 10%. It also assumes spare capacity in the child care market. And then finally, just an issue thinking about how to frame this, right? So should we think about it as a 10% reduction in prices, or because that assumes a linearity, right? If the prices are $1 million, a 10% reduction is not going to do much. If the prices are $1, a 10% reduction is also not going to do much. So thinking about maybe as a percentage of wages or something like that. So in conclusion, right, child care related costs are really important. This paper contributes to our understanding, and more people should study child care costs. So if you don't know what child care is like in the US, I'm just going to give you this quote by an anonymous woman economist, it's not actually me. But getting child care in the US is a cross between the Wild West and the Hunger Games. So I think this is a really important topic, and I'm really happy that it's being studied more. And now I'm going to become the chair, and in my role as chair, we'll take a couple of questions. Yeah, in the back.
Hi. Thank you for a great presentation. I was wondering if in your model you could show for the baseline income earned by your mother. By baseline, I mean, before childbirth, how much money was she making? Because coming from Canada, where childcare is very crazy expensive, it used to be at the time I did it. There's a huge trade-off. So will I earn enough to pay for childcare and then also justify the time I don't get to spend with my child?
Great. Other questions? Yeah.
This is really, really interesting, and I have a question which I think is in the category of a different paper. But one of the things we see in our work in the U.S. is sort of increasingly because of these issues and the high cost of housing, we see a lot of intergenerational households, and that's addressing this for many households. And I'm just curious about how that would show up in the PSID, maybe because Adrian's point, that earlier sample of the PSID is sort of more traditional older households. And one of the things we see in later periods, especially as we include more immigrant households, is that that structure really changes and will change the nature of these periods.
Okay, take one more, please.
Maybe just trying to learn from the modern part actually. So if I'm not wrong, this was individual utility maximization. I just wanted to, I'm curious to know that what happens if choices are made by a couple, because a lot of choice vehicles there are actually made by a couple, like having children is a couple decision, to a large extent having or putting child care is a couple decision. So how would, let's say, the implications of the model change if I bring in this utility function, which is the maximized, let's say, the household consumption, which is a couple's consumption along with children, and also takes into account the couple's income rather than the individual's income.
Okay, thank you. You want to respond to some of those comments?
Yes. So, hello. Okay. So, I completely agree with using a later version of PSID data. I think that would be great. But the problem that PSID does is that after 1997 they start putting data by entity. So 2 years to collect data and give my sample is data. So that's one of the reasons I'm not going to use that. But yeah, I'm sure there are ways to use it. So the point about general equilibrium effects of we have to kind of tax people to use to kind of finance childcare. That's a very important question. In my model, I have a partial equilibrium model, so I can't really take into account demand. But what I can do, I can just maybe say that, okay, budget constraint tax the income of people. So that's something I can do. Okay, so then, so I think someone asked about, I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, about what happens to the decisions of women before birth. So if I understood your question correctly. So that's what my model does. So it also shows what happens to individual decisions before they have a child. So I can actually show that in the model because I can show that. And in terms of intergenerational mobility that you mentioned, I did understand if your question was about child development and how child care,
So it's about intergenerational households coming together, living together.
Okay, so it was about that, okay. Yes, so like for example, how grandparents would exactly, okay. So yeah, I don't have that in the model, but I'm pretty sure I can have a look at it, yeah. But maybe for another. And again, your question, I'm not sure if I completely understood you mentioned that if I can tax the couple's income, or not the tax, maybe you can really think
I was thinking, what if the utility maximization function is for a couple, or a household rather than an individual?
But it is. Utility maximization is for a couple. So I model individual decisions of men and women. So I make a couple of assumptions in terms of, so there are households make decisions, I'm not modeling these decisions of men and women. So I also model the decisions of men. I make a lot of restrictions on men's decisions because men don't work necessarily part-time. Like only 10% of my sample they work part-time. So I make a lot
speakers